The gas station was quiet under the pale glow of overhead lights. Only a few cars dotted the lot, the hum of diesel engines in the distance and the soft click of a pump. Julian Price had just finished a long drive back from visiting his mother. He stepped out of his sleek black sedan in a tailored charcoal suit, still crisp despite the 4-hour drive. He looked every bit a man of discipline and authority, but to the two officers in the nearby cruiser, all they saw was a black man alone at night. Julian walked inside to pay in cash. Behind the counter, the attendant nodded, recognizing him. As Julian returned to his car, he noticed the patrol car had pulled closer. He kept his movements calm, careful not to give them any excuse. But the officers stepped out. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," barked Officer Kern, his hand resting on his holster. Julian raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" "You match the description of a suspect," Officer Burns added, already circling to the other side. Julian tried to remain composed. "I'm a licensed attorney. I have identification and—" "Hands on the car," Kern ordered. They didn't listen. They didn't care. Within seconds, Julian was slammed against his own car, cuffed and humiliated as a small crowd gathered. No one listened when he calmly said, "You're making a mistake." By the time they ran his ID, their faces began to shift. Julian Price, Bar Association card, a judge on the circuit court. But the apology never came, just silence, just a release into the dark. Julian got into his car, glanced once at the officers and drove off. Tomorrow was a court day, and they had no idea what was coming. Morning sunlight poured through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Judge Julian Price walked in through the private entrance, his robe folded neatly over his arm, face unreadable. His assistant, Ms. Carter, greeted him at the door. "Busy docket today, sir," she said, handing him a folder. Julian flipped it open and paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Two names stood out, Officer Mark Kern and Officer Stephen Burns. Internal Affairs had submitted charges, abuse of power, false arrest and racial profiling. Julian didn't flinch, he simply nodded. "Put them first on the calendar," he said quietly. Meanwhile, in the waiting area outside the courtroom, Kern and Burns sat stiffly in their uniforms. Burns was nervously tapping his foot, while Kern pretended to read over his statement. "Man, I don't get why we're even here," Burns muttered. "We did our job." Kern didn't reply. He remembered the name now, Julian Price. That ID wasn't fake. And something about the way the gas station clerk had looked at them that night had unsettled him. Inside the courtroom, the buzz of murmuring voices quieted as the bailiff announced, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Julian Price." The officers stood, shoulders straight, only for their faces to pale as Julian entered. He walked to the bench with calm authority, adjusted the mic, and scanned the room. His gaze landed on them, and he said, with no emotion, first case, the people versus officers Kern and Burns. They shifted, confused, as realization set in. Julian met their eyes and paused just long enough to let the weight hit. "This court will now come to order." The courtroom fell into dead silence. They hadn't arrested just any man. They'd arrested the judge. Judge Julian Price sat tall behind the bench, his eyes steady, voice measured. But beneath the calm exterior, a storm brewed. Not of vengeance, but of principle. He had sworn an oath to uphold the law, and today that law stood face to face with two men who thought they were above it. The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, the charges brought forth involve the unlawful detention and racially motivated profiling of an innocent civilian. Both officers conducted an arrest without probable cause." Kern's face flushed. Burns looked everywhere but at Julian. Julian interjected, "Let's begin with body cam footage." The screen lit up. Grainy night vision revealed Julian at the gas station. His posture was calm, his tone respectful. He identified himself immediately. There was no aggression, no threat, only compliance. And yet, he was shoved, cuffed, searched. The courtroom watched in stunned silence. Julian leaned forward. "Officers, you claimed he matched a description. What was that description?" Kern mumbled, "Black male, dark car, possible narcotics." Julian didn't blink. "So, a vague stereotype then?" The defense attorney stood. "Objection, Your Honor. That was not the officer's intent." Julian responded coolly, "Intent does not excuse impact, especially when constitutional rights are violated." A murmur ran through the crowd. The officers shifted again. Julian continued, "What concerns this court is not just what happened that night, but how easily it happened. No questions, no verification, just cuffs." He paused, letting his words land. Then he added, "Tell me, officers, Did you ever imagine the man you threw against the hood of his own car would be the one deciding your fate? The silence screamed louder than any confession. Julian sat back. This is not about revenge, he thought. It's about justice. Julian watched them closely from the bench, the way Kern gritted his jaw and Burns avoided eye contact. They were trained officers, but now they looked like boys caught lying. Nervous, defensive, small. The prosecutor called the first witness, Mr. Patel, the gas station attendant. Mr. Patel approached the stand and took the oath, clearly shaken but resolute. I saw everything. The judge, Mr. Price, he didn't do anything wrong. He came in, bought gas, said thank you and walked out. Those officers, they just rolled up like he was some thug. Did he raise his voice? The prosecutor asked. Never, Patel replied. He was calm, polite. I even told the officers they were wrong. They ignored me. Julian's jaw tightened, but he kept his face neutral. Next came a woman from the neighborhood, Mrs. Davis. She'd seen the incident from her car at the pump. It was disgusting, she said, her voice cracking. I started recording on my phone. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He was dressed in a suit, for heaven's sake. They just didn't care. Julian nodded slightly. Court will accept video evidence, he said. The footage played on screen, clear, damning, undeniable. Gasps echoed in the courtroom as they watched Julian calmly comply, then get thrown against the car anyway. Is this how law works now? Mrs. Davis whispered aloud, before catching herself. Julian turned to the officers. You claimed you were doing your duty, but what I see is abuse, arrogance, assumptions. The room grew still. Do you have anything to say for yourselves before this court proceeds? He asked. Kern looked up, finally meeting Julian's eyes, but he said nothing. Because what could he say? The robe Julian wore now spoke louder than any defense they had left. The courtroom remained heavy with tension. Every eye was on Judge Julian Price, waiting for the next move. Even the ceiling fans seemed to quiet. Julian turned a page in the case file, then addressed both officers. Let's be clear, he said. This court isn't here to embarrass you. But it is here to hold you accountable, because too often, this system protects uniforms instead of truth. Burns opened his mouth as if to speak, but hesitated. Kern remained stiff, expression unreadable. Julian continued, voice unwavering. You presumed I was a criminal because of my skin color. Not because I posed a threat, not because I had a weapon, not because of any real description, just because I existed in a space you didn't think I belonged in. A murmur of agreement rose from the gallery. He leaned slightly forward. And had I not been a judge, I might still be sitting in a cell right now, or worse. The prosecutor spoke up. Your Honor, we request disciplinary action from the department and formal charges of misconduct. The defense attorney objected again, insisting this was a misunderstanding at worst, nothing malicious. Julian nodded slowly. Then let's define misunderstanding, because what I see is a pattern. How many others did you stop like this? Men without cameras, without suits, without titles to protect them? The defense was silent. Julian looked back at the officers. Today, you're lucky. This courtroom offers you due process, the very thing you denied me. He paused, then added firmly, but justice will be served. A quiet gasp rippled through the room. Burns swallowed hard. Kern's shoulders drooped ever so slightly. Julian picked up his gavel. This hearing isn't over, he said. And justice had only just begun. After a brief recess, Julian returned to his chambers, closing the heavy oak door behind him. The courtroom noise faded, but the weight of the case pressed harder than ever. He sat at his desk, staring at the framed photo of his father, a civil rights lawyer who had marched in Selma, arrested more times than Julian could count. What would you do? Julian whispered aloud. He wasn't just deciding on two officers. He was staring at a system that had allowed this to happen, a system that had almost broken him when he was a young black man studying law, pulled over more times than he could remember. And now, with a gavel in hand, he had the power to demand better. There was a knock at the door. Miss Carter stepped in, her voice low. There's media outside, words spreading. People are talking about how you kept your cool. Julian nodded. Let them talk. This isn't about me. She hesitated. But sir, people need to see this, to see that someone like us can stand at that bench and demand justice. Julian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Tomorrow morning, I want every complaint those two officers have received in the past 5 years. No redactions, no favors. Yes, sir. She left quietly, closing the door behind her. Julian stood, walked to the window, and stared out over the city. It wasn't about revenge. It never was. But for every kid wrongly stopped, every man humiliated, every parent terrified when their child left home, it had to stop somewhere. And maybe it would start right here. With him, with this courtroom, with the truth. The courtroom buzzed with hushed anticipation the next morning. Reporters packed the back rows. Local activists stood shoulder to shoulder with curious citizens. Everyone wanted to see what Judge Julian Price would do next. Julian entered, robe flowing, face unreadable, but in his hands he carried a thick stack of files. He tapped the gavel. Court is in session, the bailiff called the next motion. Review of previous complaints filed against Officers Kern and Burns. Julian opened the first folder. Officer Kern. Complaint from March 3, 2023. Excessive force used during a traffic stop. Suspect was unarmed. Case dismissed internally. He opened another. September 12, 2022. Officer Burns. Racial slurs allegedly used during a domestic call. Audio mysteriously missing from bodycam footage. Case closed. One by one, Julian read off more than a dozen complaints. Patterns emerged. Black and brown citizens pulled over, detained, questioned without cause. Most complaints were buried under vague department memos or marked unsubstantiated. Murmurs rose from the crowd. The officers shifted nervously in their seats. Julian finally looked up. What we see here is not an isolated mistake. It's a habit, a shielded cycle, a system designed to protect authority, not accountability. The prosecutor nodded solemnly. Your Honor, based on this evidence, we request that both officers be suspended pending further investigation and referred to the Civilian Review Board for possible termination. The defense attorney stood, panic creeping in. Your Honor, surely this is too extreme, Julian cut in. What's extreme is watching this courtroom fill with victims who never saw justice. He took a breath. This court grants the motion, gasps, applause, a shift in the air. The gavel came down, and just like that, the balance of power tipped toward truth. As the courtroom emptied, whispers followed Julian through the marble corridors. Reporters whispered into microphones. Officers murmured in corners, some with respect, others with resentment. Julian walked calmly, but he felt the eyes. The badge didn't protect him. The robe didn't shield him. He was still a black man challenging a system. In the hallway, a young man approached timidly. Judge Price? Julian turned. The kid couldn't have been more than 20. I was there that night. At the gas station, the young man said. Didn't say anything, but I recorded it too, in case something happened to you. He handed Julian a flash drive. Julian took it, surprised. Thank you. You're the first person I've ever seen stand up like that in a courtroom. Julian looked at him carefully. You just did too. The young man nodded and walked off. Julian clenched the drive in his palm. This was bigger than a hearing now. This was a spark. Julian barely sat down in his chambers when his office line rang. He answered, already knowing who it was. Julian, came the sharp voice of Mayor Lorna Fields, you've stirred up a storm. Julian leaned back in his chair. Justice has a habit of doing that. There are council members breathing down my neck, she said. Police union reps are furious, and you've got activists calling you a hero. I'm not here for either, he replied calmly. I'm here to uphold the law. She sighed. You know I support you, but be careful. You just made enemies. Julian's tone didn't change. If doing my job makes enemies, so be it. The line was silent for a moment. Then the mayor said softly, Just watch your back. He hung up, then looked at the drive still on his desk. He hadn't even played it yet, but its existence, proof from a stranger, meant something was shifting. The community wasn't just watching, it was participating, and maybe, just maybe, the system was cracking, not from rage, not from violence, but from truth, spoken by those who refused to stay silent any longer. By mid-afternoon, the courthouse was swarming, not with protesters, but with lawyers from the police union. 3 of them waited outside Julian's chambers, arms crossed, eyes cold. Julian opened the door and didn't flinch. Gentlemen, we're filing a formal complaint, one said sharply. Your courtroom conduct was biased and unprofessional. You should have recused yourself. Julian stepped aside calmly. You're welcome to try, another lawyer sneered. This is political. You humiliated 2 officers on camera. That's not justice, that's personal. Julian looked him dead in the eye. What happened at that gas station was personal. But this courtroom, that's the law. They handed him a thick envelope and turned to leave. Julian stood in the silence afterward, envelope in hand. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He already knew the game. Smear campaigns, disciplinary threats, attempts to paint him as emotional, unstable, angry. But he wasn't angry, he was ready. They weren't just challenging his judgment, they were challenging the idea that a black man in power could call them out and still sit on the bench. But this bench? It wasn't theirs to threaten, it was his to defend. That night Julian sat alone in his study, lights dim, papers scattered across the desk. But his focus wasn't on court files, it was on an old leather-bound journal, his father's. He flipped to a page marked by a folded photo. 2 men in suits. One beaten, one defiant. They call it justice, his father had written, but only when it looks like them, sounds like them, forgives them. The rest of us, we fight to even be heard. Julian exhaled slowly. The faces had changed, the buildings, the robes, the rules. But the battle, it felt the same. His phone buzzed. A text from Miss Carter, another complaint just filed. Someone else Officer Kern roughed up last year. It's happening, sir. People are finally speaking. Julian closed the journal and smiled faintly. Not because it was over, but because it was beginning. The courtroom had become more than a room with 4 walls and a gavel. It was now a mirror. And the city, it was being forced to look. He turned off the light. Tomorrow he would return not just as a judge, but as a man with generations behind him and an entire community at his side. The courtroom was packed again, not with outrage, but with anticipation. Word had spread far beyond city limits. News crews lined the back. Students, elders, public defenders, all had come to witness what would happen next. Julian took his seat, robe flowing, eyes calm but focused. Officers Mark Kern and Stephen Burns, he began. This court has reviewed evidence, testimonies, and your history of misconduct. Your actions reflect not only poor judgment, but repeated disregard for constitutional rights. He paused. The silence stretched thick. Therefore, it is the decision of this court that both of you be stripped of duty effective immediately, pending criminal trial. Furthermore, a formal recommendation has been made for prosecution by the State Attorney's Office. Gasps. Someone clapped, then others followed. But Julian raised a hand. This is not celebration, he said. This is correction. He turned to the gallery. And let it be known, justice is not a robe, a title, or a badge. It is a standard, and no one is above it. He banged the gavel once. Court is adjourned. As he rose, the crowd stood with him, not out of obligation, but respect, and for the first time in a long time, the system looked just a little more just. Outside the courthouse, a quiet crowd had formed. No signs, no chants, just people standing together, watching Julian descend the steps. Miss Carter walked beside him. You've started something, sir. He glanced around. Elders who had fought decades ago, youth who had never believed the system could be fair, reporters, victims, even a few officers, watching, uncertain. Julian paused halfway down the steps. A boy, maybe 12, stepped forward, holding out a notebook. Can you sign this, Judge Price? Julian smiled softly and knelt. What's your name? Micah. Julian signed the page. Micah, you planning to be a judge one day? The boy nodded eagerly. Or maybe a lawyer. Like you. Julian looked him in the eyes. Then start by listening. Question everything. And always stand for what's right, even when it's hard. As Micah ran back to his mother, Julian stood tall again. The cameras flashed. But this wasn't about publicity. This was about legacy. He looked out over the city. Today wasn't the end of a case. It was the beginning of a movement. One that didn't shout, didn't burn, didn't beg. It simply stood. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. Weeks later, Julian sat once again behind the bench. But this time, the courtroom felt different. Not because the system had been fixed overnight, but because the silence had been broken. The court calendar was now filled with new cases. Complaints long ignored, reopened investigations, officers reassigned. Citizens showed up more, watched more, believed, maybe for the first time, that someone inside the system would listen. Julian reviewed documents quietly until a clerk knocked. Sir, the Civilian Review Board has just voted. Kern and Burns are officially decertified. They'll never wear a badge again. He nodded once, firm. Thank you. As the clerk left, Julian stood and walked to the window. Across the street, children played under the watchful eye of their parents. Safe, unafraid. He thought of his father, of Micah, of that gas station, the night he was judged, cuffed, humiliated. Now, justice had come full circle. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through integrity. Julian smiled faintly. Because he knew, real change doesn't always begin with a revolution. Sometimes it begins when one man refuses to stay silent. And when justice finally looks like everyone, then maybe, just maybe, it becomes real for everyone too.